There are a lot of different ways to think about God, but Christianity teaches a very particular idea about God, right? God is identified as a particular person that exists, this transcendent person who has certain attributes, a moral character, and they are personal in nature and they want a relationship with their creation, with humanity. But this is not the only idea about God that's out there. In fact, there's many people who believe in God, but believe God is something more abstract, something removed, not a person like the God of the Bible is described as a person. And so even if we're in a conversation with someone, we could maybe get to the point where we could agree, okay, God exists. But the next question would be, why does God have to be like that God of the Bible? Well, one of the big things about the God of the Bible is that they are personal in nature, a person in the same way that we are persons. So we can have a relationship with this person. This person has thoughts, this God has thoughts and desires and a certain character. But if God is like that, I mean, is there any good reason really to think that God is like that versus something more impersonal, like some type of immaterial force that just caused everything to be? Well, I think there's a number of good reasons to believe that God is personal in nature, and one of these things is something that I see in nature, in science. You know, the Bible talks about looking at the world around us to see something about the character or the existence of God. You know, it says the Bible teaches that the heavens declare the glory of God, and in Romans, Paul writes about people having no excuse when it comes to this question about does God exist or not. Paul says, you know, if you look at the world around you, it's clear that a God exists. So if that's true, then we should be able to look in nature and learn something about either the existence of God or something about their character. And I see something in many things in nature that would suggest that God exists. And one of the things I want to talk about today is DNA. Now, DNA, when I was growing up in whatever age you learn about DNA, I don't even know, is that elementary school, junior high, whatever age it was that I learned about DNA, maybe high school. I learned about, okay, DNA is this double helix, this twisty kind of structure that's inside the cell, and there's these chemicals. We call them by these different letters, A, C, G, and T, and these chemicals, they all kind of come together, and the way that they are in the structure of DNA tells the organism how to act, how to grow. That was my understanding. That's what I thought. And so growing up, I think when I first learned about DNA, I'm thinking that, well, probably the way that the organism is just sort of depends by chance. You know, there's these different chemicals and they do different things, and you just kind of mix them together like a potion or something, and you get whatever comes out. It wasn't until later I started to hear about this DNA code. And when I first heard about this DNA code, I just thought, oh, you're just referring to the way that these chemicals just happen to line up. But each chemical, in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, must have a unique, and like each chemical does its own thing, and it just happens to be sitting next to the next chemical. And yeah, they interact, but that's about it. But the reality of DNA, though, is that the chemicals in DNA, the reason that we can ascribe these letters to them is that they work together in the same way that letters in language would work, or very similar to the way a computer program would work. You can think about, like, okay, one of the letters in DNA is the letter T. We use the letter T to represent one of these chemicals that's in DNA. Well, if we think about the letter T in the English language by itself, if you just wrote T on a piece of paper, it doesn't mean anything. It has no meaning. But there's a number of different words that we could put together that would include the letter T. Even though the letter T has no meaning on its own, once you put it into a word like stop, the entire word has meaning. And if you took the letter T out, it would lose the meaning. It would say something different. It may be completely meaningless if you take the wrong letter out. But the letter on its own doesn't really have meaning. The meaning of the word is dependent on all the letters that are in the word. Does that kind of make sense? You could also think about the computer codes. If you ever seen a list of ones and zeros, and the way the ones and zeros in a computer code line up, that communicates some type of message. Well, this is the way that DNA works. The chemicals, or the letters in DNA, function based on how they are laid out in the we could say, word or the message that is being communicated. DNA not only contains a message, but contains an enormous amount of information. The DNA of an organism is essentially the blueprint for creating that thing. So in my DNA, held in my cells, is all the information it would take for me, the entire biological structure of me, to be created. So this isn't just like a single word or a single phrase, but an enormous amount of information. In fact, you could even write a message using the letters in DNA and send it to someone, and if they knew how to interpret the code, if they understood the DNA code, they could unscramble or they could translate your message and understand what you were writing to them. Because DNA works in so much like a language or like a code. I think a code is a little bit better way to describe it, but it works similar to these other ways we have of communicating. The problem with this, though, is that this idea that it is communicating a message. It means that there's information, very specific, very complicated information, which is being communicated through the DNA. Our question here is, how could we explain where this information comes from? If you think about, you're walking down the beach and you saw the letter T written on the sand, you might think, okay, probably somebody was walking by on the beach here and just wrote the letter T and walked off. Maybe there was more to it and it just got washed away. Maybe you could imagine that through chance, the waves or somebody walking by and just some type of combination of events, a T came about, and it wasn't really meant to be the letter T, it just sort of happened. And maybe you could even explain this for a couple letters. But it would be difficult to see an entire word like the word stop written and believe it came up by chance, because it's not only that the shapes of the letters themselves have appeared, but they're placed in such an order as to communicate a message. Now, you especially would think that it probably couldn't be by chance that an entire sentence or series of sentences could be written simply by chance. And this is the problem with DNA. The DNA has such extensive and enormous amount of information, and each DNA, the DNA for each organism has such an extensive amount of information that explaining how this could come up simply through chance, it would be essentially unthinkable that something like this could arrive by chance. In fact, some scientists have started to postulate, well, it's so impossible to imagine that that information could arise by chance through some unguided process, that maybe there's some force in the universe that we don't understand that draws these chemicals together, and there's some sort of unknown, heretofore unknown scientific law that just forms information from nothing. It's because it's so impossible or so unreasonable, I guess is a better way to put it, to assume that information, specific information that communicates a message, could come from some unguided process. But now we're postulating laws that we don't even know that exist. We can't imagine this information coming from chance, from some unguided physical process. In fact, if you really think about it, the only known source of information, the only time that we've ever seen information come from anywhere in the history of the world, is from people. We see people communicate to one another. We see people write in coded language, in computer code, in our own language. We see people come up with information and communicate that to others. But there's no other known source that creates information that is meant to communicate something. So where else could this information come from? The only answer the only thing we know actually can produce information is a person. And now we're finding information within the cells of every living thing. That would suggest to us that not only is there a God out there, something that created these living things, but that this thing is personal. It's a person like you and me, because it's capable of creating information and communicating a message through a code, through the very DNA in our bodies. The most reasonable explanation for the existence of information in DNA is a personal being. There's no other known explanation. And right now, people who are holding on, people who don't want to accept the idea of a personal God, have to cling to an idea that there must be a source of information that we simply don't know about. Is that really the most reasonable answer? That information, which is meant to communicate something, intentionally communicate something, would come from some unguided force? I think the most reasonable explanation for the existence of DNA is a personal God. That's why I believe that if a God exists, they must be a person just like the Bible describes.